My father married a toxic woman, and because of that my grandparents left their house to me. However, my father will not be left completely empty-handed, because my grandparents left him karma as an inheritance. I am currently 36 years old, but part of this story takes place when I was still a minor. My father is 61, and his wife, my stepmother, is 58. My parents separated when I was 6 years old, and my father married my stepmother a year later. She came into the marriage with 3 children from her previous marriage. There was supposed to be a custody arrangement where they spent summers and alternating weekends with their mother, but those visits quickly became something I dreaded. My stepmother pushed very hard for us to become one big happy family and for everyone to get along. I wasn't so much bothered by the idea itself, but by how aggressively she forced it. For starters, she insisted that I call her mom, that I need her, and that I treat her children as real siblings. I don't mind being polite to people, but siblings is a very big word, especially when it's being forced. When she didn't get what she wanted, especially the call me mom part, she would run to my father and complain. My father was what people here would call a doormat, although I'm not sure if I'm using the term correctly, so forgive me if I'm misusing it. His way of dealing with conflict was simply to avoid it entirely. He also wasn't a good father at all, let me make that clear. He would pick me up for my scheduled visits, but then leave to run errands with my stepmother or take her kids to their activities. I spent most of those visits sitting alone in the guest room they had set up for me. My belongings would disappear from that room. The toys I brought with me would end up in her children's bedrooms. The clothes I left there would get mixed in with theirs and never returned. When I complained, my father would buy me new things instead of getting my original belongings back. He handled parenting by throwing money at the problem, partly because it was easy and partly because he was terrible at managing it. I started spending more time with my grandmother instead. She lived about a 20-minute walk from my father's house. Whenever he picked me up for visits, I would ask to go to her place instead. My grandfather was still alive then, and they had a beautiful old farmhouse on 6 hectares of land in the countryside. The house had been built in the 1940s and had a wraparound porch where we would sit in the evenings. My grandmother taught me how to garden and preserve vegetables. My grandfather taught me how to identify the different kinds of trees on the property. Those summers at their house are the only good memories I have from that period of my life. When I was 11 years old, my grandparents called me into the dining room one afternoon. There were papers spread all over the table. My grandmother explained that they wanted to make sure I would always have a home. She said they were going to put the house in my name so that when they passed away, I would inherit it directly, without going through probate or any complicated legal process. I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. A man in a suit came to the house, who I assumed was a lawyer, and they did whatever was necessary to ensure the house would be mine after they died. My father found out within a week, though I don't know how. He went to my grandparents' house while I was there and argued with them in the front yard. He was not happy that I would have such an expensive property in the future. My grandmother told him the decision was final and that she would not discuss it further. He didn't speak to them for almost a month after that. When he finally did again and made comments about the house, my grandparents simply ignored him. Things got worse when I was 17. One day, my stepmother showed up unannounced at my grandparents' house. She wanted to talk to my grandfather about something related to my father's finances. I don't know exactly what they talked about, but the argument escalated. I was in another room, but I could hear shouting and bits of words. At one point I got worried and went to see what was happening, just in time to see my stepmother shove my grandfather as she was leaving. He fell onto the wooden boards of the porch. Thankfully he wasn't seriously injured, but he was 83 years old. You don't push an elderly man, especially not because you're an entitled bitch who wants his house. My grandmother, who had chosen not to get involved in the conversation, absolutely did get involved when she saw my grandfather on the ground. She took one of the guns they keep in the house and politely told my stepmother to leave the property. The tone was not polite, and the gun in her hands even less so. My father, true to his doormat nature, defended his wife. A few days later he said my grandfather must have provoked her somehow and that guns are tools of the devil. My grandmother is a saint, but if that makes her the devil, then at least she was a devil defending her property. My grandmother, also known as the devil, told him that until he apologized and took responsibility for his wife's actions, he was no longer welcome in their home. They didn't see each other for 9 months. During that time, my grandfather suffered a stroke. It was mild, but it scared all of us. My father finally went to visit him in the hospital, but things were never the same between them again. Later on, I learned that my grandfather died with terrible credit. Years earlier, my father had opened credit cards and taken out small loans in my grandfather's name without permission. He claimed he would pay them back, but he never did. My grandfather had been paying minimum payments on debt that wasn't even his for over a decade. My grandmother discovered this while going through paperwork after his death. She had his will reviewed to make sure my father couldn't get his hands on anything they left behind. Now, a bit about me. I married my husband, who is 38, 9 years ago. We have a 5-year-old daughter. During the first 3 years of my daughter's life, my stepmother refused to acknowledge her existence. She told my father that she wanted nothing to do with my child because I had been disrespectful to her over the years. That was fine with me, because having my daughter meet that excuse for a human being was not high on my priority list. Now, my father went along with her. He didn't meet his only biological granddaughter until she was almost 4 years old. Over time, he started pushing to see her, and I only agreed because my daughter began asking why she didn't have a grandfather like other children. Even then, I set strict boundaries. The visits were supervised, only lasted a few minutes, and were immediately cut short if anything felt off. My grandmother passed away 3 months ago at the age of 94. I hope I inherited most of those genes and as few of my father's as possible. I don't know if that's genetically possible, but I'm praying for a miracle here. The funeral was small. My father came alone because my stepmother said she didn't feel comfortable attending. He stayed at the farmhouse that week, claiming he needed to help sort things out. I allowed him to stay because I was too focused on funeral arrangements to think about what he might be doing. The day after the funeral, one of my stepmother's daughters, who is 40 years old, sent me a message on social media. I had changed my phone number 2 years earlier because she and her siblings constantly asked me for money for various emergencies. I never agreed, but out of concern that it might become a problem, I took precautions. The message from my stepsister asked me to sign the house over to my father and stepmother. My father and stepmother were retiring, and a farmhouse with fresh air would be perfect for them to spend their final years. She didn't even offer condolences for my grandmother. She didn't ask how I was doing. She went straight to asking for the property. In that regard, she inherited a lot from her mother. I didn't reply, but the message reminded me to contact the lawyer. I don't know if it was the same man who came when I was 11, but he was my grandmother's lawyer. The house transferred automatically upon my grandmother's death. It was already mine. I silently thanked my stepsister for reminding me and slept peacefully. A week after the funeral, my father called me. We met at a place halfway between his house and mine. We made some small talk here and there, but his real goal was to ask what my plans were for the property. I told him I planned to renovate it and possibly use it as a vacation home for my family. He agreed with the renovation part, since the house was old, but suggested it might be better if he and my stepmother lived there instead. He said they could take care of it and that we would be welcome to use it whenever we wanted. My response was no. I'm not going to ask permission to use my own house. Get another one for yourself. Then I left. That conversation happened a month ago. Since then, he has called me 6 times to talk about the house. I haven't answered a single call. He could be calling about something else, but he's my father. We all know what he's after. Last week, my stepsister sent me another message. This one was more aggressive, which I almost expected. It was like an essay explaining why my father deserved the house more than I did, for example because he was the eldest child and that it was part of some natural right and things like that. I blocked her on all platforms after reading it, but not before telling her they could take their natural rights somewhere else. Yesterday, I went to the farmhouse to meet with a contractor about renovation plans. When I arrived, the locks had been changed. I still had my original key, but it didn't work. I called a locksmith and asked him to open the door. Once inside, I noticed several items were missing. A vintage green dish set that had been in the kitchen cabinet was gone. Some of my grandmother's jewelry that I had left on the dresser in her bedroom had been taken. A collection of old photographs that had been stored in the hallway closet was missing as well. I called my father immediately, because a random burglar wouldn't have sentimental attachment to my grandparents' belongings. Sorry, my father is also a thief, but I mean a random, unrelated burglar. I asked him if he had been at the house. He said he had stopped by a few days earlier to check how things were. I asked him about the missing items. He claimed he didn't know what I was talking about. He justified it by saying maybe my grandmother had moved those things before she died, or maybe I was remembering incorrectly what had been there. I asked him what he would think if I used some of his messages and my stepsister's messages to obtain a warrant to search his house. He immediately started sounding paranoid and ended the call. The next morning, my uncle, my father's younger brother who was 57, called me. He had received some items from my grandparents. He said my father had asked him to speak to me, conveniently leaving out the missing items. I told him that part, and he said he would talk to my father. Before hanging up, he mentioned that my father and stepmother were having serious marital problems. They had briefly separated 6 months ago and were apparently on the verge of separating again. I filed a police report, but without proof of forced entry, there wasn't much they could do. I even showed them the messages, but they said that didn't prove anything. At least it gave my father a good scare. That afternoon, I changed the locks and installed security cameras at every entry point. I also installed cameras pointing at the sheds on the property, because there are tools and equipment there that belonged to my grandfather. I'm worried my father might try to take those as well. My husband thinks I should hire a lawyer to send my father a formal letter telling him he is not allowed on the property. I honestly don't know if that's necessary. It's private property, and he doesn't have access. I don't think it needs to be formal. I'm here looking for advice. I don't have proof that my father, or possibly my stepmother, stole anything, but I am 100% sure they did. They must have used some copy of a key they had from before my grandmother passed away, which is why there were no signs of forced entry. Now there are cameras and the locks have been changed, but I don't think my father is stupid enough to try again. Then again, he married my stepmother, so I suppose he could still surprise me. Update 1. I have an update for you, because my family is pure drama. About a week after installing the security cameras, I received confirmation that my father really is that stupid. I already knew, I just needed video proof. I received an alert on my phone showing someone on the property. I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee and watched the cameras in real time as he walked around the perimeter of the house, trying different windows to see if any were unlocked. Eventually he gave up and left. When I went to the police with that footage, they said it wasn't much, since it was my father and he hadn't entered the house. He shouldn't have been on the property, but it still wasn't enough to press charges. Since the police weren't doing much, I decided to wait until my father did something bad enough to actually get charged. With some luck, maybe he'd try to build a nuclear bomb in my backyard. 2 days later, he sent me a message asking to go to the property to retrieve some tools from the shed. He claimed he had lent my grandfather a set of power drills years ago and now needed them. I told him to send me proof of that, but that he would not be setting foot on the property for any reason. He became defensive, saying he didn't need permission to be on his parents' property. I reminded him it was no longer his parents' property and that they hadn't wanted him there either. The call ended badly. That same week, my husband and I drove to the farmhouse to meet a plumber. The old water heater needed replacing, and we wanted to update some of the fixtures. When we arrived, something felt off. The plumber arrived, and we walked through the house discussing the work to be done. That's when I discovered my father had found a way to get in through a window. Worse still, he had somehow managed to bypass the cameras, because I hadn't received any alerts this time. There were muddy footprints on the floor next to a broken window that definitely had not been. I checked the rest of the house as well. In the living room, the old stone fireplace had clearly been tampered with. My grandmother used to hide money in random places around the house. She was from a generation that didn't fully trust banks. I knew she kept some cash in a metal box behind a loose stone in the fireplace. The stones had been moved recently, and you could tell where the old mortar had chipped. The metal box was gone. My husband wanted to call the police immediately, but I stopped him because we would have been in the same situation as before. Instead, I took out my phone and started reviewing the security footage. That's when I saw my father, very small in the frame, crossing a corner of the screen. He was barely visible, but it was clearly him. It still wasn't enough for the police to act. I sent my father a text telling him I knew he had entered without permission and taken items that were part of the inheritance. He replied that he had every right to take what his mother had left. That was the confirmation I needed. We went straight to the police station and filed a report with all the information we had. This time, they took the case seriously and filed charges against my father. He was arrested, and his house was searched for other missing belongings. They found the items from the first theft there. He was taken into custody but released on bail shortly afterward. In the middle of all this, my uncle called me again. My father had gone to him asking for money, and my uncle had lent him about $3,000 2 weeks earlier, supposedly to fix his car. My uncle later found out from my stepsister that my father had used the money for something else. He felt used and wanted to warn me in case my father asked me for money as well. I told him I wouldn't lend him anything and that I had already gotten him into trouble because he had to pay bail. That's when I explained the entire situation to my uncle. Things escalated when my stepmother reached out. We hadn't spoken directly in some time. She started by asking me to please drop the charges against my father. She said she would return everything, but only after he was cleared of the charges. She said the stolen items were now evidence against him and could wait until the court process was over, and that the police would return them to me afterward. She then insisted that if I did this, they could manage the property for me for free since they were retired and had time, and because we were family, they would do me that favor in exchange, meaning I wouldn't have to pay for utilities or maintenance. I told her no again. Before the next part, I should clarify that since my father was arrested, I hadn't spoken to him until last week. I went back to the farmhouse to do some work, like mowing the lawn. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw my father's truck parked near the shed. I parked and walked toward it. The shed door was open, and my father was inside loading boxes into his truck. I asked him what he thought he was doing. He said he was taking things to pay himself back for the trouble I had caused him. I looked inside the boxes. They were full of my grandfather's old tools, some vintage signs that had been hanging in the shed, and several boxes of old farming equipment. I told him to put everything back, but he refused. He said those items should have gone to him in the will anyway and that he wasn't leaving without getting his money. I had gone that day with my husband, otherwise, I wouldn't have confronted him. My husband stepped between us and told my father he could either put the items back or we would call the police. I was going to do that anyway, which is why I was recording the entire interaction. My father started arguing with my husband, saying he had no right to tell him what to do because none of it belonged to him. My husband called the police while I stayed there watching my father load his truck. A patrol car arrived about 15 minutes later. I explained the situation and told them that if they checked the system, they would see my father had already paid bail for stealing from us. One of the officers asked my father to return the items he had taken from the shed. My father initially refused, claiming they were family heirlooms that belonged to him. The officer explained that this was considered theft and that it was his second offense. My father reluctantly unloaded the boxes, likely hoping he wouldn't be arrested. But once he finished and one of the officers asked me if that was everything, they told him to put his hands behind his head because he was under arrest. My father was incredulous because he had put everything back and thought he would only get a warning, but when he refused to comply, he was arrested anyway and forcibly placed in the back of the patrol car. My husband asked what would happen to my father's truck, and they told us someone would be sent to retrieve it, which they did. You could still hear my father shouting even with the door closed. He clearly had nothing nice to say about me, my husband, or my grandparents. I think he even dragged some long-dead family dog into it. They took my statement there on the spot while my father was yelling in the back, which saved me a trip to the station. The interesting outcome of all this is that my father can no longer post bail, and to make things worse for him, he lost all the money from the first bail, which I doubt was even his own. So he must be in debt to some bail bondsman right now. We have spoken with a lawyer to cover our bases, and we asked him about my husband's suggestion of sending my father a formal letter stating that he is not allowed to enter my property. Technically, we could have done that and paid the lawyer for the work, but it serves no real purpose because the law already states that you cannot enter private property. I suppose we did get something positive out of this, which was clearing up that doubt. Update 2, we have already begun renovating the house. It will be much more modern and have a lot more natural light, since we decided to enlarge the windows. My husband and I can't wait to spend weekends there with our daughter, letting her run around the property the same way I did at her age. I don't want to give too many details about the renovations because this isn't a home renovation subreddit, so I'll move on to my father and the thing he has as a wife. About 3 weeks ago, I arrived at the house and found my stepmother sitting on the front porch. I asked her if she was lost and whether she needed me to call her mother to pick her up, but she gave me one of those murderous looks and said we should cut the nonsense, that I knew why she was there. I replied honestly that I had no idea what the two of us could possibly have to talk about. I knew she was separating or divorcing my father, so his current legal situation shouldn't have mattered to her. Apparently it did, because she planned to divorce him, but, with all my father's legal problems, she wasn't going to get anything. What she wanted was for me to drop the charges so she could divorce him and get what she considered her fair share. I'm not a lawyer, but a criminal case shouldn't prevent them from divorcing and dividing assets. What my stepmother really meant, and what she didn't want to admit out of embarrassment, was that she wanted me to drop the charges and give her part of my property so that when she divorced my father, she could take something from him. As tempting as it was to let my father have hope only to crush it later with a divorce, it was far more appealing to let my father face the charges and have my stepmother walk away with nothing. She claimed my father didn't want the whole house, just part of the land, that there were plenty of unused acres and a few would be enough. It was a great offer, give her part of my property for free and then have my father as my neighbor. Even better, maybe my stepmother would change her mind and stay with him. A few weeks later, my uncle called me with important information. My stepmother had officially filed for divorce and had moved to another state to live with one of her children. While she would have liked to get something from my father, the house belonged to him before they married, and with part of my property, who knows what would have happened. In the end, she accepted defeat and left with very little. My father asked my uncle to help sell the house and show it so he could pay legal fees. That's where things stand for now, my father in jail awaiting trial, and my stepmother far away and out of our lives. I hope things haven't calmed down so much that I have nothing more to tell you, not because I want drama in my life, but because I've started to enjoy writing here. I'll update again once my father's trial is over. Edit, some people asked about my mother, but she isn't part of this story. She doesn't live nearby, and my grandparents were my father's parents, which is why I didn't include her. She is on my side, of course, but that's all I can really say. Maybe that she's happy my father is in jail, but that's because they've never had a good relationship since the divorce, and no, my father didn't cheat on her, or at least that's what my mother says. Update 3, I'm back with a small update that won't actually be small. It has a bit of everything, from laughter to tears, but it's worth it. The renovations are finished, and we're already using the house as a weekend home. Maybe I didn't mention it before because I didn't think it was relevant, but we live about an hour away, so it's a way to disconnect from our weekly routine. I'm continuing my grandmother's tradition of having a garden and preserving food, something I hope my daughter will also adopt. My husband takes care of the rest of the property, and we enjoy spending the day outside when the weather is good. My father was sentenced for grand theft. Here, any theft over $4,000, actually a bit less but I'm rounding, is considered grand theft. The value of what he stole the first time, which I recovered, wasn't very high, but what he tried to take from the shed was, and he was stealing in broad daylight with police arriving and seeing everything. Maybe the judge showed mercy because he returned the items, but he still received 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 1 year for good behavior. The other good news is that my uncle helped sell the house, which covered all the expenses, and the positive part is that my father won't be living nearby even after he's released. I don't know where he'll end up afterward, but he won't be welcome here. My husband still keeps my grandparents' firearms, just in case things get ugly, which I don't expect because we've upgraded the cameras and the entire security system. We can't be here every weekend, and we don't want to live worried about someone trying to rob us. Now the alarm system immediately alerts the monitoring office, which then contacts the police if suspicious activity is detected. We haven't had to test it yet, but if my father wants to, he can be the guinea pig. He has also finalized his divorce, and according to my uncle, my ex-stepmother walked away with very little. The only valuable thing my father had was the house, but it belonged to him before the marriage, so it wasn't part of the divorce settlement. I don't think there will be tears in my final update after all, because so far everything has been positive, unless we count my father crying when he heard his verdict, but I wasn't there, so that's just a guess. I like to think he did. Now for the funny part involving my ex-stepmother. Until recently, she was living with one of her children. None of her children got involved in all this except her daughter, which will matter later. My ex-stepmother called my uncle offering more information. She had been kicked out of her son's house for being the way she is. I don't know all the details because it's her version, but according to her, she had to slap her daughter-in-law because she wasn't doing what she should and wasn't cooperating with her. I can easily imagine how that happened, knowing how intense my ex-stepmother can be, and I'm fairly sure the daughter-in-law didn't deserve it, even though I don't know her. She now lives with her daughter, who hates her, yes, the same one who messaged me, not because she cared about me but because she wanted a vacation house here. I'd love to be a fly on the wall for that, but I'm fine watching from a distance. Which brings us to the funniest part, I think my ex-stepmother tried to seduce my uncle. He says no, but she offered to take very good care of him if he let her stay. My uncle insists she only meant taking care of the house and things like that, but I'm convinced she wanted a taste of my uncle and he just didn't realize it. At least she was divorced when it happened. I just find it hilarious how she tries to cling to this family in any way possible, a family I want nothing to do with, though not counting my uncle. He rejected her immediately, but at least he's provided me with enough information about my ex-stepmother to close out this story. Update 4. It's been a long time since my last update, over a year and a half. There are a few things to tell if you still want to read them. My father was released from prison and moved to another city within the state. A distant cousin helped him get a job there, and he needs it because he has nothing left after prison. I haven't had any contact with him since before his trial ended, which is a good thing. As for my ex-stepmother, I know absolutely nothing. She must have a wounded ego after being rejected by my uncle. To this day, he insists she wasn't flirting with him, which makes him the only person in the universe who thinks that, because even his friends believe my ex-stepmother wanted to get into his pants. Deep down, he probably thinks so too, but he doesn't want to admit it because the idea disgusts him.